We refer to ourselves as Onondowaga, people of the Great Hill, which is part of the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy. Nyaweskano gagwego sano waga ni gyatso, hanandio ni gyatso, agenyo guayo, Onondowaga ni Tonawonde Onondowaga. And you can see the translation, so I don't need to do that. I lost something here. There we go. This is the sign entering the Tonawanda Seneca Nation territory. Tonawonde translates to where the waters run swiftly or swiftly running waters. Onondowaga is how we refer to ourselves in our Onondowaga Goano, or our language, and that translates to people of the Great Hill. And Yoindzade translates to Mother Earth, but we translate that to our nation territory. Here you can see the communities of the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy, or as we call ourselves, Haudenosaunee, which means people of the Longhouse, or as we also call ourselves internally and through our ceremonial observances and language, Ongwe'owe, which means the real people. As you can see, the blue territories are the Seneca Nation territories, and Tonawanda is the northernmost and one of the smaller of the Seneca territories. Within the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy, we as Senecas are considered keepers of the eastern door. For me, the Longhouse is the nucleus of our cultural identity in Tonawanda. My extended family in Tonawanda is a large part of that nucleus of our traditional Longhouse. For me, having grown up with Tonawanda's Longhouse being a foundation for my cultural identity, that traditional foundation and creativity in our art really is a aspect of creativity, is our tradition, and always has been. The title of my research proposal here through the Artist Leadership Program at the CRC here at the National Museum of the American Indian is Seneca Identity of Adornment. And that's primarily because I wanted to look at everything that I could that we wear, and that was a great way to squeeze everything in. But the primary focus of my research here is really to look at the beadwork patterning within our traditional clothing. So for instance, the predominant beadwork patterning historically that you're going to find in present day in our communities really is a design that's similar to what you see here, which is a sky world pattern motif. I've just taken this sky world pattern motif and created it using cassettes and CDs of traditional ceremonial and medicine society recordings that I researched back in '97. Try that again. Oh. And like I said, my foundation in our traditional arts really started early with my own beadwork and the creation of my own traditional clothing. And so on the left-hand side, you see a gustoet. The single feather on the top of that gustoet indicates to the rest of the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy that I am Onondowaga, or that I am Seneca Nation. The feathers that you see there are primarily feathers that I hunted. And then in the middle is the breechcloth that I created for myself and beadworked for myself in my teens. And the image on the left is a watercolor painting of my breechcloth. So some of the research that I'm engaging here in the CRC is beadwork patterns. And what I'm looking for specifically is I'm looking for the swirl pattern designs. The swirl pattern designs is something that I use very prevalently in my artwork, and oftentimes when I explain that these come fundamentally from our concepts of beadwork designs, a lot of people question that. And so my assertion is to say these are evidence of the level of artistic expression that we've incorporated into our beadwork patterns. And I'm taking something historically that isn't necessarily recognized and reasserting it back into my artistic expressive language on many different levels. So these are a couple of the patterns that include those swirl designs that I've come across in the collection. I'm also a designer. Like I said, I'm a multimedia artist. And so you can see in these two beadwork patterns that are contemporary bags that I've designed, which are part of my Life's Beautiful Journey holiday greeting card line, you see my contemporary interpretation of these beadwork patterns. The bag on the left is titled Holiday Festival of Lights, reflecting kind of the holiday environment on the Niagara River and the Niagara Gorge. And again, you see the sky dome pattern up at the top and the swirls at the bottom. And the piece on the left is really influenced and originates from our concept of a tree of peace and how the Five Nations Iroquois Confederacy, the original Five Nations, were united under a tree of peace. So I've taken that historic cultural context and I've interpreted it into a holiday tree of peace. And of course, with the design on the left, it's not beaded, it's more of an artistic interpretation. And I send these cards to back to my family in Tonawanda every year. And the year that I sent that card back, they all know I know how to do beadwork. So when I returned home for ceremonies, they all asked me how come I didn't bead that card. So I beaded the card on the left to appease the extended family. Like I said, I'm a multimedia contemporary artist. I work in two-dimensional imagery. Primarily prints, and you can see in the print on the left, which is Sky Woman, and the Earth Grasper, which represents our creation story. You can see that swirl patterning on the bottom. You can see the sky dome motif and the level of swirl incorporated all throughout my compositions. In my compositions, I also assert an Indigenous worldview and concept that we believe in, that the living world or the living environment has a living force, has a spirit. And so I work with the concept of a portrait of a natural environment. And so you can see the moon and the kind of sun-looking piece are eyes. The swirl in the middle is a nose. And then the big, what are wings or what are arms or what are teeth for each of the individuals is the mouth. And on the left-hand side, the red swirl is an eye. The triangular piece coming in is another eye. And the Neonge, or the deer crossing the composition on the bottom, is the mouth. And that's what I mean when I say I work with a concept of a portrait of a natural environment. And this is another example of a portrait of a natural environment. Hino is a kind of slang term for the Thunderers. We refer to the Thunderers as our grandfathers. In our Gaiweo, we are told that the Thunderers come from the east, but in the future interpretation of our Gaiweo, we are also told that at some point in the future, the Thunderers will come from the west and they'll be a destructive force. And that's what that's the point I'm getting across in my composition here. And again, it's a portrait of a cultural environment. So the swirl on the left is one eye. The moon, or Soikat Gahkwa, is the other moon. The triangle, blue portion is the nose, and then the black portion is the mouth. And many of my concepts and compositions are really drawn from our oral traditions, and especially our oral traditions that are drawn from pre-contact. This piece is called Wolf Sucking Up the Resources, and again is one of these portraits within the natural environment. And so you see, again, the moon, Soikat Gahkwa, is one eye. The kind of shooting star on the left is another eye. At the bottom in the V shape, one area to the left is darker, and that's the nose. And then you have the area where he's actually sucking up the water, which is the mouth. And then the two brown pieces are the claws of the wolf. I'm a multimedia artist. I use whatever resources I can get my hands on, so I do a form of art that I call alternative art. Again, a lot of my work is drawn from our oral traditions and our concepts of these living entities or beings within the natural world. And the flying head in our oral traditions is an aspect of the wind. It's not the wind itself, but it is an aspect of the wind. And so I've used resources available to me because as Indigenous people, we have always used the resources available to us. At one point in time in our history, those resources were limited to natural materials. We've always been innovative in adapting to whatever those resources are. And I'm continuing that historic tradition by using whatever resources are available to me. So this piece is made out of plastic detergent containers and plastic milk jugs. This piece here, Coyote's Recycled Transformation, is also evident. I'm doing these pieces as recycled art in honoring transformation, because for us as Indigenous people, transformation is very much a part of the natural world that we recognize and we recognize in our oral traditions. And so our oral traditions in recognizing transformation, to me, in my interpretation, are very contemporary and a very intellectual, abstract way of perceiving our relationship with the natural world through our oral traditions. This is a washboard transformed into an effigy I titled Damned Effigy. This is really influenced by some of the water wars in the Pacific Northwest, where I live now, specifically in eastern Washington along the Columbia River. A number of years ago, there was a drought, and the water wars erupted between the agriculturalists, the fishermen, and the environmentalists about how those limited resources were going to be utilized. And this is the piece I created based on that. Like I say, I play around with a lot of materials, and my transformation concept here is to take stereotypes and transform them into valuable pieces of contemporary art, titled Toying with Stereotypes of Tribal Dada. The fringe on these pieces are made from dentalia, and I use wiggly eyes very often in my pieces. I'm also a potter, and so I'm going to share very quickly some pottery images with you. These are all hand-coiled pottery pieces that are influenced from our historic style of pottery. The ones on the bottom are kind of pushing the contemporary form. The ones on the top are more recent, and the ones on the top left are my most recent, where I'm actually incorporating the swirl pattern concepts and designs into the neck as opposed to the linear incision. I always wanted to work large scale with these pieces. I've loved to work larger than this, but this piece is 24 inches tall by 20 inches wide. I really wanted a piece that was larger, but that was lightweight and that had thick walls. And so I created this piece using cardboard, plaster of Paris, and paper pulp. So the paper pulp is sculpted to be relief on the surface. And what this really is, in the title Man Infestation Destiny, is it's meant to be a bomb, and it's meant to be the negative ramifications of bombing and the poisons and nuclear waste from these types of materials. So this is actually a fish. The eyes that you see on the top portion on the far side of the screen are its eyes. At the bottom, you can just barely see a mouth. In the very middle, you see a fin. And then the neck of the pottery vessel really represents the tail of the fish. I wanted this to be 3 inches thick in wall thickness, and so this is the interior, and this is why I wanted it to be 3 inches thick, but I didn't want the weight. Within our historic style pottery on the crowns, oftentimes figurines or faces will be shown. And so I did the same thing with this piece in a contemporary artistic form of expression, where what I'm doing is I'm culturally reappropriating or taking back the concept of Edward Monk's scream, because Edward Monk's scream really was influenced by him seeing a South American native mummy in a museum in Europe. And so I'm taking that concept, I'm culturally reappropriating it back to us as Indigenous people where it belongs, and I created the body using 22 shell casings that I used to hunt with when I lived back in Tonawanda. I've also translated our pottery forms into glass, and these were 2 glass pottery forms that I made last year at the Pilchuck Glass School. And I'm also a designer, so I take my concepts of designs and I incorporate them into many things. I've done many logos. The American Indian Council logo on the left was a logo I created when I worked here for the Smithsonian, but not for the National Museum of the American Indian at that time. And because as a designer, I wasn't paid for that logo when I was working for the National Museum of the American Indian later on, and I was serving as a consultant on a team of folks who were defining the National Museum of the American Indians identity package. I researched the sun symbols that you see all throughout the museum, and once I researched those and we proposed them and we agreed that that was the direction we were going to go, we realized as a team that we didn't have a sun symbol that really defined a contemporary Native American experience. And so I was asked to design a contemporary Native American sun logo, and the hand logo that you see here is my design. So those are my hands, and that was contributed to the initial National Museum of the American Indian Identity ephemeral package. I thank you very much.